The cause of your cravings is not your blood sugar spiking and then falling. It's this. In all actuality, it very well could be your blood sugar rising and then crashing, but we have to look deeper than that. So when you look at feedback mechanisms within your body, there's nothing specifically, like physiologically, not attached with our brain that would be necessarily telling us to eat when our blood sugar crashes. So there's a lot of kind of theory out there that, okay, well, when your blood sugar rises and then it falls, that's what makes you hungry, because this lower level of blood sugar is telling you that you need to eat. There's a problem with that theory. The problem is that our glucose levels are never really supposed to go super, super low anyway. They should just kind of stabilize. It's sort of this modern world we live in that causes the potential for them to crash. And what I mean by that is we weren't consuming ridiculously high glycemic things before. Now we consume them on the regular, and that would cause a steep rise and a steep crash. So I've got some interesting science that we should look at to understand what's truly causing a craving and what we can do to combat it.
I also put a link down below for a company that makes a C15 for people that don't eat a lot of cheese or people that want to get those C15 levels up. A lot of their research was funded by the United States Navy. They have some really interesting stuff. It's a company called Fatty 15. I've talked to Dr. Van Watson multiple times, and I've even interviewed her on this channel. She is who really is one of the people that kind of started discovering this deficiency in dolphins. But this is something that's been talked about across the literature for a long time, but only recently has become sort of household information. I put a link down below for you to try Fatty 15 if it's something that's of interest to you. I think it's a very important compound. It is a form of saturated fat. So it's not like you're talking anything really weird here. It's a saturated fat that we would get from good quality cheeses, but the amount of cheese you'd have to eat to get our levels back up, and again, this is a real deficiency, would be a lot of cheese. So that link is down below. It's a 15% off discount link, top line of the description underneath this video. I highly encourage you to at least go there and read some of the literature. It's fascinating.
So the first thing that we have to look at is there was a study that was published in the journal Appetite. Okay, and this is interesting because it took a look at subjects that had a higher carbohydrate breakfast versus a lower carbohydrate breakfast. Okay, and they found that the higher carbohydrate breakfast did lead to a pretty decent spike in glucose, and 3 hours later, a pretty decent crash. Okay, and they noticed that the appetite was significantly higher in the group that had the spike and the fall. Okay, well, at first you think, well, that's pretty strong correlation there. And it is, but correlation does not equal causation. For example, the reason the lower carb group may have had more control wasn't necessarily because their glucose wasn't rising and falling, but it could have been something happening in the brain as well. But where things start to get really iffy and kind of weird is that if you look at more data, you find, well, the smaller the spike and the smaller the drop, the less cravings and the less appetite. The bigger the spike and the bigger the drop, the more the cravings and more the appetite. But what we're starting to understand now is that it's not so much blood sugar related as it is what's happening in the brain with what's called the nucleus accumbens region of the brain. And with this, we start looking at rodent model data. Now, we have to look at rodent model data occasionally because it's the only way we can take a look through the looking glass and kind of see what's coming and what we need to look at next in humans. So when we consume higher glycemic carbohydrates, we notice that there is a significant light up of what's called the nucleus accumbens region of the brain. This is the region of the brain that is associated with reward. Now, we've known for a while that sugar lights up the brain like a Christmas tree under fMRI scan. So we know that being able to control that is probably good. But what we're getting at with this whole situation is when we light up the brain and then the brain dims down, well, just like any kind of drug that you would be exposed to, you need more and more to get the fix. It just so happens that the brain seems to dim, this nucleus accumbens region of the brain, it starts to dim and have less overall energy to it, coinciding with our glucose. But just because it coincides with our glucose doesn't mean that they are connected and communicating with one another. You see, if we were to go out and do some kind of upper street drug like stimulant, it may not affect our glucose at all, but it's going to affect our brain. So in theory, carbohydrates or high glycemic carbohydrates are working in tandem. They certainly affect our glucose because they are a fuel, but perhaps the way they actually hit our palate and the way they respond within our body, independent of glucose, is affecting our brain. So I have some strategies for you to sort of combat these cravings. Because the problem is if you reduce refined carbs, it's going to take a couple of weeks for your brain to not want those carbs. okay, but it's not going to take long for your body to not want the carbs. So you're going to have this delta in between that's a little bit hard, right? Like your body doesn't need the carbs anymore, but your brain is still craving them. So one of the things I'd recommend is consuming electrolyte packets like salt, because salt can help you with those cravings immensely because it affects what are called NST neurons in the hindbrain. So you could add a little bit of salt to your water. That could make a difference. I notice it makes a big difference for me. If I'm craving something, I just have some salt water. It makes a big difference. Another thing that you may want to consider doing, if you really want to mess around and get kind of crazy with it, exogenous ketones could play a role here. Now, exogenous ketones, if you don't know what those are supplemental forms of ketones. It doesn't mean that you're in ketosis. Ketone salts would work. Exogenous ketone esters would work. And this is a much more expensive option, but it's worth mentioning the power with it, right? Because yes, you could take an electrolyte packet or a pinch of salt, and that's going to be a fraction of a penny compared to, say, like having some exogenous ketones or exogenous ketone esters, which might be like $1 or $2 a serving, right? But exogenous ketones are interesting because they raise our blood beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, and that is a compound that can cross through the blood-brain barrier and impact our appetite in different ways with different regions of the brain. So that is a good strategy if you say, hey, I'm going to go low carb. I'm not just going to cut out refined starches. I'm going to cut out carbs all the way. And I want to be able to add something that's going to kind of nullify these like icky feelings that I get when I want these cravings. So that's something you could try. And I would try doing that in the morning and in the evening. Or if you start feeling cravings coming on, you could try it, but you really want to beat it to the punch. You want to be having ketone levels a little bit higher to sort of buffer that. Because the cool thing is once you do get into natural ketosis, you really don't need those anymore because then you're producing the ketones that satisfy those cravings to begin with. Another thing that you can do that's quite interesting that works really well is if you need to find a way to like spike your glucose and get your glucose up to kind of regulate things, if you sit in a sauna or even do a cold plunge, that is a way to kind of spike epinephrine and norepinephrine levels, which can have a big impact on your glucose. And if you're starting to go hypoglycemic and go down and you notice this correlation with you having cravings there, that might help you out quite a bit. But in addition to that, since we don't know if the glucose thing is really true or not, having epinephrine or norepinephrine is going to reduce appetite to begin with. So I've talked to a lot of people that have replaced their morning coffee with doing a cold plunge for that reason. The big shot in epinephrine and norepinephrine that you get, that adrenaline pop, that kills your appetite and it wakes you up just like coffee. But if you have access to a cold plunge, swimming pool, or literally just a cold shower, that can really trigger that state shift that you need to no longer crave. Okay, so we do need to replace one addiction or one highlight or one dopamine hit with another. But you don't want to do something that's going to be terrible for you. You want to do something that might also be constructive. So I hope these tips help you out with this and understand that it's not just about the rise and fall of glucose. It's more about what's happening up here. I'll see you tomorrow.